February 3, 1944. Prisoner of war camp, Trent Park, England. General Major Ludwig Crüwell sat in the comfortable interrogation room watching a captured American military training film his British captors had decided to show him. The German Africa Corps commander, captured in North Africa in 1942, had agreed to view American training materials as part of an intelligence assessment the British were conducting. The film was titled Why We Fight and featured animated sequences, Hollywood-style production values, and simplified explanations of complex military concepts. Another film demonstrated infantry tactics using actors' clear narration and step-by-step instructions that treated soldiers like they were learning to operate machinery rather than preparing for combat. After 15 minutes, Crüwell started laughing. He couldn't help himself. The films were so thoroughly American, entertaining, simplistic, designed for mass audiences with no presumption of prior knowledge. They looked like propaganda mixed with primary school instruction. This is how Americans train their soldiers? Crüwell asked his British interrogator, still chuckling. With cartoons and Hollywood productions? They treat warfare like it's a technical manual for operating a tractor. Where's the emphasis on fighting spirit? On warrior ethos? On the intangible qualities that make soldiers fight? The British officer, who'd seen American training methods firsthand, remained silent as Crüwell continued his assessment. German military training emphasizes character development, physical hardship, and the creation of warriors who understand combat through experience and tradition. These American films, he gestured dismissively at the screen, treat soldiers like factory workers learning assembly line procedures. They standardize what cannot be standardized. They simplify what is inherently complex. They assume soldiers are interchangeable parts that can be mass-produced using industrial training methods. Crüwell wrote in his assessment for German intelligence, American training philosophy reflects their industrial commercial mindset. They produce soldiers like automobiles, standardized with minimum acceptable quality, using simplified procedures that any recruit can learn. This approach may fill their armies with bodies, but it will not create warriors. When their mass-produced soldiers encounter German troops trained in proper military tradition, American forces will break despite their material superiority. Training quality matters more than training quantity. What Crüwell didn't know, what German military intelligence would fail to understand until too late, was that he'd just dismissed the most effective military training system in history. A system that would transform millions of American civilians into competent soldiers in months rather than years. A system that would produce armies capable of defeating German forces that had spent decades developing their warrior culture. Within 5 months, American soldiers trained using those cartoon methods in Hollywood films would storm Normandy beaches and begin fighting German forces with effectiveness that would shock Wehrmacht commanders. Within 6 months, American units composed of soldiers with 6 months training would be defeating German units with years of military tradition. This is the story of how American training films revolutionized military education, how industrial methods defeated traditional warrior culture, and how German officers' laughter turned to grim recognition as soldiers trained with cartoons proved more adaptable, better led, and ultimately more effective than soldiers trained through Prussian tradition. To understand why German officers laughed at American training films, you need to understand the German military training philosophy. A tradition dating to Frederick the Great, emphasizing character development, hardship, and the creation of warriors rather than soldiers. German military training reflected centuries of Prussian tradition, long service requirements. German soldiers served multi-year terms, allowing extensive training, unit cohesion development, and absorption of military culture. Quality over quantity came through extended training periods. Hardship as pedagogy. German training emphasized physical and psychological hardship as character building. Soldiers learned through adversity, not comfort. Difficult training created tough soldiers, or so the theory went. Warrior ethos. German military culture emphasized fighting spirit, aggression, and warrior qualities that couldn't be taught through technical instruction. Soldiers weren't technicians. They were warriors. Traditional teaching methods. German training used live instruction by NCOs and officers who'd learned through the same system. Knowledge passed person to person through demonstration and practice, not through standardized media. Unit cohesion emphasis. German soldiers trained in units that would fight together, developing bonds through shared hardship. The regiment was family. Soldiers fought for comrades, not abstractions. Class-based leadership. German officers came from specific social classes, attended military academies for years, and absorbed leadership through cultural immersion impossible to replicate quickly. This system had worked for Germany for centuries. It had created armies that conquered Europe in 1870, nearly won World War I, and achieved spectacular victories in 1939 to 1941. German military commanders believed their training system was superior to all others, proven through combat results. Oberst Hans von Luck, who commanded units from Poland through France to North Africa, explained the German perspective in his post-war memoir. We Germans understood that creating soldiers required time, tradition, and hardship. You couldn't mass-produce warriors using industrial methods. American attempts to train millions of soldiers in months using films and simplified procedures violated everything we knew about military training. We assumed their soldiers would be technically competent but spiritually hollow, able to operate equipment but unable to withstand the stress of real combat. We believed our training system, emphasizing character and unit cohesion over technical skills, would produce superior soldiers despite American material advantages. American military training in World War II represented a radical departure from traditional methods. Rather than trying to replicate European military tradition, Americans approached training as an industrial problem requiring industrial solutions. The U.S. military faced an unprecedented challenge: transform millions of civilians into competent soldiers in months, not years. Traditional training methods couldn't scale to meet this requirement. The solution was training innovation that would revolutionize military education. Key American training innovations: training films, professional productions using Hollywood talent, clear narration, and visual instruction that could teach complex skills to mass audiences simultaneously. Films could be shown to thousands of soldiers at once, delivering consistent instruction impossible with live teaching. Standardized curricula. Every soldier learned the same skills in the same sequence using the same materials. Standardization ensured minimum competency while allowing mass training impossible with individualized instruction. Task-oriented training. American training focused on specific skills needed for specific jobs. Rather than creating complete warriors, Americans trained specialists who could perform defined tasks competently. Simplified procedures. Complex military operations were broken into step-by-step procedures that could be memorized and practiced. The goal was competent performance, not deep understanding. Accelerated timelines. Basic training was compressed from years to weeks. Specialized training was completed in months. Speed was prioritized over perfection because armies needed soldiers immediately. Educational psychology. American training incorporated learning theory, psychological research, and scientific pedagogy. Training was designed based on research about how humans learn, not just military tradition. The training film program was the centerpiece of this revolution. The U.S. military produced over 450 training films during the war, covering everything from basic weapons handling to complex combined arms operations. Major American training film series. Why We Fight series. 7 films directed by Frank Capra, explaining the war's context and purpose. Used animation, documentary footage, and narrative to educate soldiers about why they were fighting. Technical training films. Hundreds of films teaching specific skills. Weapons operation, vehicle maintenance, radio procedures, medical treatment. Each film broke complex tasks into simple steps. Tactical training films. Films demonstrating infantry tactics, artillery coordination, and air-ground cooperation. Showed proper procedures that soldiers could study and replicate. Leadership training. Films teaching NCO and officer leadership techniques using scenarios and expert narration. These films weren't entertainment, they were teaching tools based on educational research, showing that visual instruction with clear narration was more effective than lectures or text alone. But to German officers accustomed to traditional military training, they looked like Hollywood propaganda, not serious military education. German intelligence obtained American training materials through various sources. Captured documents, defectors, propaganda analysis. German military officers reviewing these materials consistently expressed contempt for American training methods. Wehrmacht intelligence report from March 1944. American military training emphasizes technical skills over warrior spirit. Their training films treat warfare as if it were industrial process rather than test of character and will. They standardize instruction, attempting to create interchangeable soldiers through mass production methods. This approach may enable rapid expansion of their forces, but it will not create soldiers capable of withstanding stress of combat against properly trained German troops. American emphasis on comfort, simplified procedures, and technical instruction over hardship and character development suggests their soldiers will perform adequately in favorable conditions but will break under sustained pressure. Individual German officers expressed similar views. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, reviewing intelligence about American training, wrote, "Americans are attempting to mass-produce soldiers using industrial methods. This is philosophically flawed. Soldiers are not automobiles that can be built on assembly lines. Military effectiveness requires intangible qualities, courage, aggression, unit cohesion that cannot be taught through films and simplified procedures. American training may produce technically competent soldiers, but it will not create warriors. When American units face battle-hardened German forces, American technical training will prove inadequate substitute for German character and tradition." The mockery wasn't just about training films, it reflected broader German contempt for American military capabilities. German officers believed that American society, commercial, individualistic, comfortable, couldn't produce soldiers capable of matching German warrior culture developed through centuries of military tradition. This conviction that German training system was superior would persist until American soldiers trained using those inadequate methods proved otherwise in combat. D-Day and the Normandy campaign provided a definitive test of training philosophies. American soldiers, many with only 6 months of total military service, would face German defenders with years of military tradition and combat experience. June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach. American soldiers from the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions stormed Omaha Beach under devastating fire. These weren't professional soldiers, they were civilians who'd become soldiers through 6-month training programs, emphasizing the simplified procedures and technical skills German officers had mocked. The initial assault was chaos. Heavy casualties, disorganized units, and destroyed command structures. By traditional military theory emphasizing unit cohesion and experienced leadership, American forces should have broken. They didn't. Individual soldiers and small groups, often led by sergeants or even privates, adapted to circumstances, improvised solutions, and achieved objectives without higher direction. The training films had taught specific tactics. The standardized procedures had created common vocabulary and shared understanding. The simplified instruction had given soldiers tools to solve problems independently. By day's end, American forces had secured beachheads despite 2,400 killed and 3,000 wounded. They'd overcome obstacles German defenders thought were insurmountable, and they'd done it using the mass-produced soldiers German intelligence had dismissed as technically competent but spiritually hollow. Oberst Fritz Ziegelmann, Chief of Staff of the German 352nd Infantry Division defending Omaha Beach, wrote in his after-action report, "American soldiers demonstrated unexpected adaptability and initiative. When their officers were killed or separated, junior leaders and even individual soldiers continued attacking. Their training appeared to emphasize decentralized decision-making and individual initiative, qualities we associated with German soldiers but didn't expect from Americans. They used standardized small unit tactics that allowed separated groups to coordinate effectively without direct command. This suggests American training methods, which we dismissed as oversimplified, actually produced soldiers capable of independent action. The Normandy bocage, dense hedgerow country, provided unexpected test of training effectiveness. The terrain favored defenders, negated Allied advantages in armor and artillery, and required small unit tactics German doctrine emphasized but American training supposedly neglected. In the bocage, German defenders should have dominated. They had terrain advantage, they had experienced soldiers, and they had training emphasizing independent action. American forces were supposed to be technically competent but doctrinally rigid, unable to adapt without detailed orders. Instead, American units adapted rapidly. Within days of encountering bocage terrain, American sergeants and junior officers were developing improvised tactics, using explosives to breach hedgerows, coordinating infantry tank teams, and employing fire and maneuver techniques their training had emphasized. The training films had taught these tactics. The standardized procedures had given soldiers common framework. When circumstances required adaptation, soldiers applied principles they'd learned through simplified instruction to solve problems their instructors hadn't anticipated. Sergeant Curtis Cullen, an American tank driver, exemplified this adaptation. He invented the rhinoceros hedgerow cutter, improvised steel teeth welded to tank fronts that could crash through bulkage. Within weeks, American tanks across Normandy were using variations of this field modification. This kind of improvisation, taking technical knowledge and applying it creatively to solve unexpected problems, was exactly what German doctrine said standardized training couldn't produce. Yet American soldiers trained through simplified procedures and training films were doing it routinely. Major Helmut Ritgen, commanding German tank units in Normandy, wrote in July 1944, "American forces are adapting to bulkage faster than we anticipated. Their junior leaders show initiative we didn't expect from armies supposedly trained through standardized procedures. They're modifying tactics, improvising equipment, and coordinating operations with flexibility, suggesting their training, while different from ours, is producing effective results." We may have underestimated American training systems' ability to create competent, adaptable soldiers in short time frames. One of German officers' primary criticisms of American training was that real military leadership, required years of development through military culture immersion, impossible to replicate quickly. German officers attended military academies for years. They absorbed leadership through cultural tradition, class identity, and extended mentorship. The idea that Americans could create competent leaders in months using training films and accelerated programs seemed absurd. But American leadership training, while different, proved effective. The Officer Candidate School, OCS system, produced officers in 90 days. These 90-day wonders were mocked initially, even by American regulars, as inadequately trained. But in combat, many proved highly capable. The American system worked because it focused on practical skills rather than cultural immersion. Training films taught leadership techniques explicitly. Standardized procedures gave leaders frameworks for decision-making. Emphasis on decentralized operations meant junior leaders received authority and responsibility that forced rapid development. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, commanding the 2nd Ranger Battalion at Pointe du Hoc, was a typical American officer, civilian lawyer who'd received accelerated military training. On D-Day, he led the assault on heavily fortified positions, adapted to circumstances when initial plans failed, and achieved objectives against strong opposition. His leadership wasn't based on military tradition. It was based on practical skills learned through accelerated training. German commanders observing American leadership in action were forced to reconsider assumptions about what was required to create effective military leaders. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Lehr Division, wrote in August 1944, "American officers at battalion and company level are proving more capable than we expected. Many are civilians with minimal military background who received rapid training. Yet they're leading effectively, making sound decisions, and adapting to circumstances. Their leadership style is different from ours, more collaborative, less authoritarian, but it's producing results." We underestimated American ability to create competent leaders quickly using standardized training systems. Perhaps the most dramatic proof of the American training system's effectiveness was the casualty replacement pipeline. American units could absorb massive casualties, receive individual replacements with minimal training integration, and maintain effectiveness. German doctrine emphasized unit cohesion developed through extended training together. Replacements disrupted this cohesion and reduced effectiveness until new soldiers were absorbed over time. American units, conversely, could integrate replacements quickly because standardized training meant all soldiers had learned the same procedures. This advantage became critical as the Normandy campaign produced heavy casualties. American divisions could lose 100% of original infantry strength, be rebuilt with replacements, and continue fighting effectively. German units suffering similar casualties often collapsed or required complete rebuilding. The training films and standardized procedures meant American replacements arriving at the front already knew the tactics, procedures, and techniques their units were using. They could be integrated within days rather than weeks. Private First Class Harold Baumgarten, wounded at Omaha Beach, returned to his unit after recovery. He found entirely different soldiers, replacements for casualties, but the same tactics and procedures he'd learned in training. The standardization allowed him to fight effectively with soldiers he'd never trained with. American training films and standardized documentation provided another unexpected advantage: institutional learning that captured and spread combat lessons rapidly. When American units developed effective tactics in Normandy, those tactics could be quickly documented, filmed, and distributed to other units. Training materials were updated based on combat experience, and new techniques appeared in training films within weeks. German forces had traditional methods: after-action reports, word of mouth, and gradual dissemination through replacement training. American forces, however, had industrial communication, training updates distributed systematically, new films produced incorporating the latest lessons, and standardized bulletins reaching all units simultaneously. This meant American forces learned from each other's experiences faster than German forces. A tactic developed by one battalion in July could be taught to divisions still in England by August. German military tradition, which German officers considered superior, actually slowed learning compared to American industrial educational methods. By August 1944, German officers who'd mocked American training methods were being forced to reconsider fundamentally. American soldiers, trained through films and simplified procedures, were proving as effective, sometimes more effective, than German soldiers trained through military tradition. This realization was psychologically devastating. German military identity was built on belief in their training system's superiority. If American industrial educational methods could produce equally effective soldiers in months rather than years, what did that say about German tradition? Oberst Hans von Luck, captured in September 1944, was interrogated about German assessments of American forces. His response revealed the psychological impact. "We were wrong about American training. We mocked their films and standardized procedures as overly simplified. We assumed their soldiers would be technically competent but lacking in warrior spirit. In combat, we found American soldiers were adaptable, well-led at junior levels, and capable of sustained operations under adverse conditions. Their training system, while completely different from ours, produces effective soldiers faster than ours." This is a difficult admission for a German officer who spent years in military academies, but it's a truth we can no longer deny. After the war, military analysts from multiple nations studied American training methods. The conclusion was near universal. American training represented a genuine revolution in military education that other militaries needed to adopt. Key findings: scalability. American methods could train millions of soldiers simultaneously, impossible with traditional apprenticeship models. Standardization advantages. Common training created common vocabulary and procedures that enabled coordination without extensive shared experience. Accelerated competency. The American system produced adequately trained soldiers in months versus years required by traditional systems. Adaptability. American emphasis on problem-solving and decentralized operations produced soldiers capable of adaptation despite simplified training. Cost-effectiveness. Training films and standardized materials reduced per-soldier training costs dramatically while maintaining quality. Institutional learning. Documentation and systematic dissemination of lessons. Learned created organizational learning impossible with traditional oral culture. German military officers studying American training post-war acknowledged they'd misunderstood the American approach. General Major WWII Crüwell, who had laughed at training films in 1944, wrote in 1952, "I was wrong to mock American training films. They represented a systematic approach to mass military education that we Germans never developed because we relied on military tradition and extended service. Americans treated training as an engineering problem requiring an industrial solution. Their films weren't entertainment. They were teaching tools based on educational research about how humans learn. They worked. American soldiers trained in months using these methods proved as capable as German soldiers trained over years. This is a humbling admission, but it's reality. American training system was an innovation we failed to recognize because it was so different from our tradition." June 1994, Normandy, France, 50-year anniversary of D-Day. Veterans from both sides gathered at Omaha Beach for commemoration. Among them was former Major Harold Baumgarten, who'd landed at Omaha Beach with the 29th Infantry Division, and former Oberst Fritz Ziegelmann, who'd defended the beach as 352nd Infantry Division Chief of Staff. Through translators, they discussed their experiences and the training that had prepared them for combat. Baumgarten spoke first. "I trained for 6 months total before landing here. I watched training films, practiced standardized procedures, learned simplified tactics. German officers supposedly mocked our training as inadequate. But that training worked. When I hit this beach and everything went to hell, I knew what to do because the training had been clear, practical, and focused on specific skills I'd need. The films weren't entertainment. They were effective teaching tools that prepared millions of American civilians for combat in timeframes impossible with traditional military training." Ziegelmann responded, "I defended this beach believing American soldiers would be technically competent, but would break under sustained pressure because your training emphasized procedures over character. I was wrong. American soldiers showed courage, initiative, and adaptability. Your training system, while completely different from ours, produced soldiers capable of defeating German forces we considered superior. We underestimated American training because it violated our assumptions about what military training should be." A military education researcher in the audience asked, "What lesson should modern militaries learn from this?" Baumgarten answered, "That effective training isn't about tradition, it's about results. American training was effective because it was designed systematically using research about how people learn. It scaled to train millions. It produced competent soldiers quickly. It worked. Traditional military training may create better soldiers given unlimited time, but modern warfare doesn't allow unlimited time. The military that can train effectively at scale wins." The ceremony concluded with both sides acknowledging that the American training revolution had changed military education permanently. Traditional apprenticeship models were obsolete for modern mass armies. Former U.S. Army Chief of Staff General Gordon Sullivan delivered closing words. "German officers laughed at our training films because they seemed unsophisticated compared to Prussian military tradition. But those films and the training system they represented allowed America to transform millions of civilians into an army that defeated forces considered the world's most professional military. That wasn't luck. It was effective application of industrial and educational methods to military training. The lesson is that innovation matters more than tradition when you're trying to solve problems traditional methods can't address." German training was excellent for creating a small professional army. American training was excellent for creating a massive citizen army. We needed the latter, so we developed a system that worked. The American training film revolution permanently changed military education worldwide. Every modern military uses video-based instruction, standardized training, and systematic educational methods pioneered by Americans in World War II. Final statistics. American Training Film Program. Total training films produced 450 plus. Total specialized training manuals 1,000 plus. Soldiers trained using film-based instruction 12 million plus. Training time reduction versus traditional methods 60 to 70%. Per soldier training cost reduction 50% plus. Officer candidate school graduation rate 90%. OCS training time 90 days versus years in traditional systems. Combat effectiveness comparison, Normandy. American soldiers average training time 6 to 12 months. German soldiers average training time 24 to 36 months. Combat effectiveness ratings, comparable. Adaptation speed to new tactics, American advantage. Junior Leadership Initiative, American advantage. Casualty replacement integration, American significant advantage. Post-war adoption, NATO militaries adopting film-based training, 100%. Training film production, 1945 to 1960, 10,000 plus across all NATO forces. Modern military video instruction, universal. Influence on civilian education. Extensive training film techniques influence post-war educational media. The story of American training films is ultimately about how innovation can defeat tradition when innovation is based on systematic understanding of human learning, and tradition is based on assumptions that haven't been tested. German officers laughed at American training films in 1944 because those films violated every assumption German military culture held about how soldiers should be trained. Films seemed like entertainment, not serious military instruction. Simplified procedures seemed inadequate for complex warfare. Standardization seemed to ignore intangible qualities of warrior spirit. General Major Crüwell had watched those films in February 1944 and concluded American training was philosophically flawed. He'd been confident that German tradition, emphasizing hardship, character, and extended training would produce superior soldiers despite American material advantages. He'd been wrong. By June 1944, American soldiers trained using those films were storming Normandy beaches and defeating German defenders Crüwell's system had produced. By August, American forces were breaking out across France. By May 1945, American armies trained through industrial educational methods had defeated German forces trained through centuries of military tradition. The films worked not because they were entertaining, but because they were based on research about how humans learn. The standardization worked not because it ignored warrior spirit, but because it provided a framework allowing millions of civilians to become competent soldiers quickly. The simplified procedures worked not because warfare is simple, but because breaking complex tasks into learnable steps allows rapid skill acquisition. American training didn't try to create perfect soldiers. It tried to create adequate soldiers at scale and speed traditional training couldn't match. That was strategic insight German officers missed when they mocked the films. In total war requiring mass armies, adequate soldiers available immediately beat perfect soldiers available eventually. The laughter stopped in Normandy when German commanders realized American soldiers trained through cartoons were as capable as German soldiers trained through tradition. It stopped permanently when post-war analysis confirmed the American training system was an innovation that changed military education forever. Modern militaries worldwide use descendants of those training films German officers mocked. Video instruction, standardized curricula, systematic educational design, all traced directly to American innovations of 1942 to 1945. German officers laughed at training films until they saw results in Normandy. Then they stopped laughing and started learning. The simple training films that looked like Hollywood entertainment proved more effective at creating competent soldiers at scale than centuries of Prussian military tradition. That was the lesson German officers learned too late. That innovation based on systematic understanding of human learning defeats tradition based on untested assumptions about warrior culture. The films worked, the soldiers they trained won, and military training changed forever because Americans had approached training as an engineering problem requiring a systematic solution rather than a cultural tradition requiring extended immersion. German officers laughed at training films. American soldiers trained with those films stormed beaches, defeated defenders, and proved that effective military training isn't about tradition, it's about results. The laughter died in Normandy. The innovation lived on in every military training program worldwide.